It started the way most ordinary days do, quiet, gray, and unassuming. Officer Mason Turner had just poured his second cup of stale coffee when the front door of the Cedar Falls Police Department creaked open. No one was at the door, no footsteps, no chatter, just the hiss of rain spitting against the glass. Then came the low, wet thump. Everyone turned. The sound was unmistakable, something heavy being dropped on linoleum. There, in the center of the lobby, stood a German shepherd, drenched in rainwater, steam curling off its back like ghost smoke. Its chest heaved, tongue curled at the side of its jaw, and dangling from its teeth was a child's backpack, bloodied and soaked. Silence. Not a single soul moved as the dog dropped the pack onto the floor, took 3 steps back, and sat down, still, alert, waiting. Mason's pulse kicked into gear. That bag wasn't just stained, it was soaked. Strips of red soaked deep into the faded fabric, seeping through a stitched-on unicorn patch. One of the zippers was torn halfway off, as if it had been yanked violently. The dog stared straight at him, through him almost. And then, just like that, it let out a sharp bark that echoed down the empty corridor like a siren no one wanted to hear. Officer Mason Turner wasn't the kind of man who believed in fate. He believed in facts, forensics, and paperwork filed in triplicate. But the way the dog locked eyes with him made something stir, something old and buried. It reminded him of the one case he never solved, the one that still woke him at night. He moved forward cautiously, holding his palm low. The dog didn't flinch. It let him approach. "What do we have here?" Mason murmured. He knelt beside the pack. It was a standard school bag, pink, sparkly, with a cracked name tag still legible. Emily R. in looping cursive. Dispatcher Carla poked her head from the front desk. "Mason, that's from Willow Creek Elementary. I recognize the design. My niece has the same one." Mason's brow furrowed. "Any reports on a missing kid from that school?" "No," Carla replied slowly. "At least, not yet." "Call them anyway. Find out if an Emily R. didn't show up today or yesterday." The dog let out another bark, this one louder, urgent. Mason turned to him. "Where did you come from, boy?" The dog spun on its paws and ran to the glass door, looking back as if expecting them to follow. Then it barked again, twice, and scratched the door. "I think he wants us to go," Carla said softly. "Yeah," Mason replied, "and I think I'm going to listen." The rain was still coming down in thin sheets when Mason slid behind the wheel of his cruiser. The book up and Numzan, invited, unbothered, leapt into the back seat like he belonged there. No hesitation, no commands. Mason glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "No tag, no chip, no harness. Where's your handler?" The dog responded with a low whine and tapped his paw against the cage. Then he barked. Once. "Right, let's go." The dog leaned toward the window, ears twitching, nose pressed against the glass. As Mason pulled away from the station, the shepherd barked at the next left turn. "You're kidding." Another bark, same direction. Mason sighed and took the turn. 20 minutes later, they were deep into the rural stretch on the outskirts of town. A narrow gravel road wound between tall trees, wet branches arching overhead like a tunnel. Mason's headlights flicked across an old wooden mailbox, rusted and leaning sideways. The dog stood stiff in the back seat, tail rigid. Mason parked. They stepped out together, man and dog, into the thick, damp air. The house at the end of the drive was barely standing. Half the siding was rotted, windows covered with cardboard and duct tape. The grass was knee-high and wild. There were children's toys scattered across the mud, broken, weathered, and forgotten. The dog growled low and stepped forward. Mason unholstered his flashlight. "You sure this is the place?" The dog barked once, short and hard, and took off toward the backyard. Behind the house was a small, overgrown garden and what looked like a burned-out fire pit. Ash and melted plastic crusted the ground. Mason crouched and picked up a half-charred Barbie shoe. His jaw tightened. The shepherd began pawing at a patch of wet dirt beside the pit. Mason hurried over and started digging with his hands. Seconds later, his fingers touched something smooth, metal. He yanked it out. A child's lunchbox, dented and caked in mud. The sticker on the front was peeling, but the name etched faintly into the top was clear. "Sammy B." Mason looked at the dog. "That name mean anything to you?" The dog didn't answer, of course, but his stare said everything Mason needed to know. Back at the station, A rapid cross-check of school records and attendance logs revealed something alarming. 5 children, all from Willow Creek Elementary, hadn't shown up for school in over 3 days. None of them had been officially reported missing. 2 had parents who were unreachable. 3 others were supposedly on vacation, according to emails sent by someone who claimed to be their guardian. Mason stared at the screen. Emily R., Sammy B., Hannah T., Lucas K., and Trevor D. All second graders, all from the same class, all vanished. Carla, he said, his voice tight, this isn't a coincidence. She looked back at him, pale. What do we do? Mason turned to the dog, now curled on the lobby floor like a soldier awaiting orders. We follow him. The next morning, under clear skies and with tactical backup in tow, Mason and the dog, now unofficially dubbed Ghost, returned to the woods behind the burnt-out house. It didn't take long before Ghost locked onto a scent trail. They followed him half a mile through mud and leaves until he stopped at a large tree stump. There, hidden beneath moss and earth, was a wooden trapdoor, its hinges rusted but recently disturbed. Mason's heart pounded as he motioned the others. Call it in, he ordered. We may have just found where they're keeping them. He grabbed the handle, took a deep breath, and pulled. The door groaned like a dying animal. As Mason pulled back the heavy wooden hatch, a cold breath of stale air wafted up from the darkness. His flashlight cut through the black like a blade, but the beam hit nothing except a narrow staircase vanishing into the ground. Dirt walls, wooden steps, the smell of mold, sweat, and something else. Something sharp and chemical hung thick in the air. Ghost, Mason whispered. The German Shepherd was already at the edge, ears alert, nose twitching wildly. The dog let out a low whimper, then pawed the first step and waited. Mason exhaled and turned toward the officers behind him. We go quiet, lights low, guns up. If those kids are down there, we get them out alive. If anything else is down there, we deal with it. They nodded in grim unison. Ghost led the way. The staircase descended deeper than expected, at least 30 feet beneath the forest floor. Every creak of wood underfoot echoed. Every breath seemed to grow heavier. The hallway at the bottom was narrow and damp. Pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping water that left rust-colored streaks on the walls. At the far end, a single flickering light bulb hung from a wire, swinging gently as if someone had just passed by. Mason raised his hand and stopped the group. Ghost was frozen, his body stiff, his eyes locked on the door just ahead. Then they heard it, a faint sound, high-pitched, a whimper, or a child crying. Mason's jaw clenched. Move. The door creaked open. Inside was a small concrete room with bare walls and a single mattress shoved into the corner. The air smelled of mildew and old urine. The room was empty, but not untouched. Children's drawings covered one wall, stick figures, stars, and trees. Names were scribbled in childish handwriting. Emily, Lucas, Sammy, Trevor, Hannah. 5 names. Ghost sniffed the drawings and let out a mournful whine. He pawed at the floor, then darted toward a metal vent near the bottom of the wall. It was just wide enough for sound and scent to travel. Another room, Mason muttered. Looks like this place connects underground, said Officer Daniels. Could be a series of these cells. Ghost, Mason said. Find them. Back on the surface, Carla was already making calls. We've got no records on this property owner. Deed was filed under a Shell LLC with a fake address, but the last power record shows someone rerouted electricity here just 6 weeks ago. Mason listened it over the radio as Ghost led the team through another door, deeper into the maze of underground rooms. He felt the walls closing in around them, literally and metaphorically. This wasn't just a forgotten shelter. This was a design trap. Someone had built this place with intention. Room by room, they searched. Each held clues, shoes, half-eaten cereal boxes, crayon marks on the wall, but no kids. In one room, Ghost stopped dead in his tracks, his tail dropped. He began to growl. There was something buried under a pile of blankets in the corner. Mason stepped forward cautiously, lifting the fabric. Underneath was a voice recorder, blinking red. He pressed play. A girl's voice crackled through the static, trembling but clear. He said, we can't go outside until the sun disappears. If you hear this, please tell my mom I didn't run away. Please. The tape cut off abruptly. Ghost barked once, then began scratching at the wall next to the recorder. Mason pressed his ear to it. Hollow. Get the gear. We're breaking through. Within 20 minutes, they'd cracked open the wall and found another passage. This one narrower, twisting like a snake beneath the earth. They followed Ghost, who moved faster now, more sure of himself. The path ended at a sealed steel door, padlocked and chained. Mason raised his fist, but before he could knock, a voice rang out from the other side. Small, weak. Is someone there? Mason's heart caught in his throat. Emily, Trevor, anyone. Lucas, the voice whispered. Ghost whined and licked the floor beneath the door. Lucas, it's okay. You're safe now. We're police. We've come to take you home. Is the dog with you? Mason smiled despite the lump in his throat. Yeah, buddy, he's right here. He found us. They broke the lock. Inside the room, 5 children huddled together, wrapped in blankets, their faces pale and hollow, but alive. Emily R. held Trevor's hand tightly. Hannah sobbed quietly into Sammy's shoulder. Lucas stood guard by the door with a broken chair leg clutched in his shaking hands. When they saw Ghost, they didn't run. They reached. They buried their tiny hands into his fur and cried against his neck. He stayed with us, Emily said through tears. He brought us food. He barked when he heard people coming. He never left. Mason blinked back his own tears. He brought you home. Back at the station, the children were evaluated by medical teams and wrapped in warm blankets. Mason sat outside the exam room, sipping lukewarm coffee, staring at Ghost. You really did it, he said quietly. You found them. The vet had arrived and scanned the dog. No chip, no ID, no service, tattoo, nothing. Whoever he belonged to had either erased the trail or never marked him to begin with. He's yours now, you know, Carla said, walking over. That dog chose you. Mason didn't answer right away. He was still staring at the door. At the 5 kids sitting inside. At the miracle. He's not mine, he finally said. He's theirs. By nightfall, media vans were parked outside the station. The story was already spreading. 5 missing kids, hidden underground for days. No ransom, no demand, no known kidnapper. Just a stray dog with a bloodied backpack who wouldn't take no for an answer. The sheriff ordered all information to be locked down until the investigation expanded. The children were placed in protective custody and their parents were vetted. Some were crying with joy, others weren't answering phones. Something was still off, but for now they had time. And they had Ghost. Later that night, as Mason sat alone in the quiet squad room, Ghost rested by his feet. He stared at the whiteboard filled with photos, names, timelines, and a question scrawled in red. Why these 5? No connections, no shared bus routes, no same after-school programs, nothing that screamed target. Unless his eyes drifted to a crumpled paper recovered from the backpack. A childish drawing of 5 stick figures holding hands, standing in front of a building. The words above read, "The ones who see the hidden door." Mason felt his spine stiffen. Ghost lifted his head. We're not done, are we? Mason said quietly. Ghost stared at the paper, then let out a low, quiet growl. No, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. 3 days had passed since the children were rescued. Cedar Falls was no longer quiet. What once was a sleepy town tucked between the pines had become a buzzing hive of reporters, investigators, and parents with wide eyes and tighter grips on their children's hands. But the deeper the investigation went, the more questions surfaced, and answers didn't come easy. Mason Turner stood in the police conference room, a fresh cup of coffee cooling in his hand. The wall in front of him was covered in a sea of note cards, printouts, and red yarn connecting photos and names like a twisted family tree. At the center of it all, 5 elementary school children, huddled in the picture taken at the hospital. Alive but haunted. Ghost sat at Mason's feet, calm but alert, eyes tracking every officer that moved through the room. If the dog had a past, it remained locked tight in his amber gaze. So, said Detective Sarah Lynn, a transfer from the state's missing persons unit, you're telling me 5 kids go missing for a week? Nobody reports it, and we're supposed to accept that as coincidence? Mason didn't look away from the board. That's what the records say. Well, she snorted, either we've got a town full of negligent parents or someone paid them off to stay silent. The leads were thin. Each of the 5 children came from different neighborhoods, different family structures. A couple were raised by single parents. One lived with grandparents. One had a mother who worked nights. Another with a father who often traveled for work. No common church, no common bus route, no shared extracurriculars. And still, they vanished within the same 48-hour window. And somehow nobody noticed, except Ghost. Mason visited the hospital again that afternoon. The kids were under 24-hour supervision, accompanied by trauma counselors in a rotating security detail. But they hadn't said much. Until now, he walked into room 2B to find Emily sitting cross-legged on the bed, coloring. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail. She looked up when she saw Ghost and smiled, then gave Mason a small wave. "He likes you," she said, nodding toward the dog. Mason crouched beside her. "He seems to like you too. You okay talking for a bit?" Emily nodded. "I just wanted to ask you something simple," Mason said gently. "Anything you can remember might help us. Do you remember the day you were taken?" She bit her lip and looked down at her coloring book. "Emily, I didn't know it was bad at first," she said quietly. "We were supposed to go on a field trip." "A field trip? Who told you that?" "A man, he had a badge and everything, said he worked for the school." Mason's blood ran cold. "Did the others go with you?" She nodded. They were already in the van. Mason left the hospital with his jaw clenched and his gut twisted. A man with a badge, a van, a fake field trip. He called Carla. "Pull surveillance footage from Willow Creek Elementary. Every angle from the week before the kids disappeared." Carla was already on it. "I found something, actually. You're going to want to see this." Back at the station, the grainy footage rolled on a screen. It was from a Wednesday morning, exactly 1 week before the children went missing. The school parking lot was bustling, parents dropping off, teachers walking in. Then, just before 7:30 a.m., a white utility van pulled into the staff lot. A man stepped out, clipboard in hand, wearing a high-vis vest. He was tall, with a dark beard and sunglasses. He spoke briefly with the janitor, pointed at something, and was waved through toward the rear entrance of the school. Mason froze the frame. No license plate on the front. The back plate was blurred. "Run facial recognition," he said. "Already did," Carla replied. "Nothing in the system, no DMV match, no federal hits." Mason exhaled through his nose. "So we've got a ghost driving a ghost van." Meanwhile, Ghost had been pacing near Mason's desk for the last hour. Restless, focused. Mason bent down. "You got something?" The dog barked once and stared at the backpack, still sealed in evidence. "You already brought us this," Mason said. "What else are we missing?" Ghost whined and nudged the pack with his nose, then pawed at the floor. "No," Mason whispered, "not the bag." He lifted the bottom flap again, and that's when he saw it. A small Velcro compartment, hidden beneath the inner lining. It had torn slightly from the blood and moisture. Inside, Mason found a rolled-up sheet of yellow paper, folded 6 times over. He carefully opened it. Childish handwriting covered the page, written in different crayon colors. In the center, 5 stick figures stood in a circle. Beneath each was a name, but below them, drawn in black crayon, was a 6th figure, taller, with red eyes and a jagged smile. Above it read, "The Bad One." Below it, he said, "We belong to him now." Mason leaned back in his chair. "We've got a monster, and he's done this before." The next day, the FBI arrived in force. Missing persons agents, psychological profilers, and a mobile crime lab parked in the station lot. But Mason didn't care for their briefings or politics. He cared about Ghost, and Ghost was scratching at the back wall of the station again. "What is it, boy?" Mason asked. The dog turned, barked once, then ran down the hallway back toward the evidence room. When Mason caught up, Ghost was already pawing at a shelf marked Unsolved 2002-2012. Mason frowned. That's where they kept the cold cases. He pulled the box Ghost fixated on. Inside, a photo. A red-haired girl. Age 9, missing since 2006. Mason's stomach twisted. He remembered this one. Her backpack had been found in a creek. Unzipped. Blood-stained. The inside flap had a note written in crayon. "We saw the hidden door." Mason staggered back. It couldn't be. The children from this week had drawn the same phrase. Later that night, Mason sat alone in the darkened station, Ghost resting silently beside him. The caseboard now held more than just names. It held shadows from the past. 5 children gone and recovered. But how many weren't? And how many more would vanish before they found the bad one? He looked at the Polaroid they'd found near the trapdoor. It was faded, but he now noticed something he hadn't before. In the background, barely visible through the trees, was a white van parked just out of frame. There was no time left to wait. "Come on, Ghost," he said, standing. "We're not chasing shadows anymore. We're dragging them into the light." It started again, this time in another state. 400 miles south of Cedar Falls, in the backwoods of a small Kentucky town, a fisherman casting from a riverbank found something floating in the current. At first, he thought it was trash, until he saw the pink strap. Until he pulled it from the water and realized it was a child's backpack, half-zipped, blood-stained, and tangled with a clump of long blonde hair. Mason sat in the Cedar Falls police station reading the alert. The report was brief, Clinical. No child reported missing in the area. No one had come forward to claim the bag. It had been turned over to the local sheriff, who immediately flagged the FBI because of one detail. Inside the front pocket was a sheet of yellow construction paper, folded. Same handwriting, same 5-stick figure drawing, same 6-figure looming in black crayon with red eyes. The bad one. On the back, written in faint pencil, was the phrase, "We're not the only ones." Mason swallowed hard. Ghost, sitting at his side, let out a low growl. The FBI was beginning to connect the dots. Or rather, they were trying to. As of now, the agency had quietly linked 3 old cases across different states, all with eerily similar patterns. Same age group, same missing time window, same silence from local communities. And now, matching notes in backpacks. Mason stood in a field operations meeting, surrounded by suits and badges, staring at the pinboard like it might give him divine insight. He didn't need insight. He needed truth. "Why the secrecy?" Mason asked the lead FBI agent, a tall, composed woman named Agent Rhodes. "We don't want to tip them off," she said. "Tip who off?" Mason snapped. "Because if someone out there is staging these abductions across state lines, it's not one guy in a white van, it's a network. And they're 5 steps ahead of us." Rhodes stared at him for a long moment, "Which is exactly why we don't go public. Yet." Ghost barked sharply, startling everyone in the room. Mason didn't flinch. He looked down and nodded. "Exactly," he muttered. "We don't have time for bureaucracy." That night, Mason couldn't sleep. The idea that more kids were out there, trapped, silenced, forgotten, gnawed at him like an old wound reopened. He sat on his back porch with a beer in hand and Ghost laying quietly at his feet, his tail flicking rhythmically. The summer air was heavy with crickets and humidity. "You knew," Mason said aloud. "Somehow you knew they were down there." Ghost lifted his head slightly, then rested it back on his paws. "Where'd you come from, huh?" Mason whispered. "No tag, no chip. No handler ever claimed him." Ghost was a mystery all his own. The next morning, Carla rushed into the station with the file in her hand. "You're going to want to see this," she said breathlessly. We did another round of cross-referencing, attendance patterns, school transfer records, missing kids with weird circumstances. Mason leaned in as she laid out 5 more names. 10 years ago, she said, different town, same state, all 5 children went missing over 1 school week, all under the age of 10. The case went cold. But get this, she flipped the page. This girl, she pointed at a photo of a red-haired child, was the older sister of one of the kids we just rescued. Mason froze. "Which one?" "Lucas." Mason blinked. Why didn't anyone tell us he had a sister? She was never listed in his current school records. She disappeared in 2013. Lucas wasn't even 2 years old back then. Parents moved to Cedar Falls 3 years later. Mason leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "This can't be a coincidence." "It's not," Carla whispered. Ghost barked from the hallway, then trotted toward the main entrance. As Mason followed, he noticed Ghost wasn't barking randomly. He was sniffing, focused, and methodical. He was tracking. Again, Ghost led Mason out of the station, through the lot, and toward the woods behind the department. Mason had always known there was an old storage shed near the back fence line, overgrown and unused for years. But Ghost wasn't headed there. He pushed past it, following a trail so faint even Mason couldn't see what had caught the dog's attention. 20 minutes into the woods, Ghost stopped, right at the edge of a small ravine. Mason caught up, breathing hard, wiping sweat from his brow. "What is it, boy?" Ghost was standing still, head lowered, ears pinned back. Then Mason saw it. Down in the ravine, half covered in vines and moss, was a slab of concrete. No markings, no signs. Just a door, sealed shut. Mason's pulse spiked. "Carla," he said into his radio, "get me backup out here now. I think we've got another one." By the time backup arrived, behind, Ghost had already begun pawing at the edges of the slab. The soil was loose, disturbed. Someone had opened it recently. Mason and 2 other officers pried the slab open to reveal a rusted staircase leading into the ground. Again, the pattern repeated. Underground, hidden, purpose-built. Mason turned to Ghost, who was already halfway down the steps. "Let's find out what they didn't want us to see." The air inside was thicker than before. This bunker was older, moldier, but not empty. Inside the first room were bunk beds, 6 of them. On the walls were scribbles, toys, and scratched-out names. A rotting desk held a small stack of Polaroids. Mason flipped through them, his hands shaking. Each photo showed a different child, some smiling, some crying, each one holding a sign with a number and date, like mugshots. But there were no adults, no captors, only children. The last photo chilled Mason to the core. It showed a child sitting cross-legged in the dirt, her face hidden behind her hair. But her shirt was unmistakable, a Willow Creek Elementary tee. Date on the bottom, just 2 weeks ago. Back at the station, the FBI sealed off the bunker and confirmed what Mason already knew. It was part of a larger network, one that moved children across county and state lines, kept no paper trail, and operated underground. Literally. The new theory, the bunkers were relay points, temporary holding stations before the kids were moved somewhere else. The question was, where were they being taken and why? And how many more locations were still out there? Late that night, Mason sat with Ghost on the steps of the station. The breeze was warm, but the air felt colder somehow. He stared out into the quiet night. Whoever they are, he said, they're not just criminals. Ghost turned his head slightly, as if listening. They're organized, they're experienced, and they've been doing this a long time. He took a sip of black coffee. We've only scratched the surface. Ghost nudged his knee with a soft bark. Mason smiled faintly. Yeah, I know, we're not done yet. It started with static. Just a soft crackle, faint as a whisper, buried deep in the audio analysis of the recovered Polaroids from the Kentucky bunker. One of the crime techs had been scanning each photo for hidden clues when he noticed something odd in the paper stock. A thin strip of magnetic tape embedded inside one of the photo borders. A hidden micro-recorder. Mason stood in the evidence room, arms folded, watching the tech replay the audio again and again. The sound was distorted, warped by moisture and time, but the voice was unmistakable. A child, a girl, breathing hard, whispering. He said we go where the sun can't find us, but the dog knows the way. He's still here. We heard him barking through the floor. The room fell silent. Ghost, lying near the wall, perked up and let out a soft growl. She's talking about you, Mason muttered, kneeling beside the dog. You were close. You were right above them. The tech looked shaken. That recording's got to be at least a week old, maybe more. But some kid knew that dog was looking for her. And somehow she knew he wasn't giving up. Mason didn't sleep that night. Instead, he spread every map of the region across the squad room table, cross-referencing known structures, abandoned shelters, basements, even old coal shafts. He marked every location tied to the kids: the school, the trapdoor in the woods, the Kentucky riverbank, the second bunker. When he connected them, they formed something terrifyingly deliberate. A triangle. Each site was almost exactly 100 miles apart. The center of the triangle sat deep in the Appalachian foothills, an area with no official structures. Just wilderness, no cell coverage, and more importantly, no eyes. Mason tapped the center of the map. This is where they're taking them. The next morning, the task force assembled. Mason, Ghost, Agent Rhodes, and 2 tactical units prepped for a ground search in the marked forest zone. No roads, no buildings, just rumors of a long-abandoned military communications base used during the Cold War. And possibly something far worse now. Before leaving, Mason stopped by the hospital one last time. Lucas was sitting by the window, a comic book open in his lap. Mason sat across from him. You doing okay, buddy? Lucas nodded but didn't smile. His voice was quiet. Are you still looking for them? I am. Lucas hesitated, then whispered, There's more kids. I saw them. Before they blindfolded us. Before the van stopped. There were kids already there. I heard them crying at night. Mason's throat tightened. How many? Lucas shrugged. I don't know, maybe 6, 7. He paused. One of them kept singing every night, same song. What song? Lucas hummed a simple, haunting tune. She said it helped her remember the scare. The team reached the woods by noon. Ghost jumped from the truck before the engine even cut. His nose went to the ground instantly, tail stiff. He moved fast, too fast for guesswork. He had a trail. How does he know where to go? Agent Rhodes asked, watching the shepherd disappear into the trees. Mason answered without hesitation. Because someone's still waiting to be found. After an hour of trekking, they found it. Hidden behind a collapsed pine grove, beneath a moss-covered rock formation, was a narrow metal grate welded into the ground like an air vent. Mason crouched. It wasn't just a grate, it was a staircase entrance, covered with decades of growth. They pried it open, and a wave of hot, rancid air poured out. Ghost barked furiously and lunged down the steps, tail high. Tactical units followed. Mason pulled his radio. We're breaching a third site. No known records. Suspected underground facility. The descent was steep. Concrete walls, flickering lights, mold and rust covered everything. But the deeper they went, the more it became clear. This was no abandoned military base. It was being used. The first room was a command center of sorts. Tables, monitors, static-filled radios, maps with pinned photos, photos of children, school IDs, bus routes. Some images were marked with black X's. Mason felt his stomach drop. These aren't just victims, he whispered. They're being selected. On a desk sat a worn-out ledger. Inside, dates, initials, drop-off times, and something labeled processing. No one wanted to ask what that meant. Ghost growled sharply, then darted toward a hallway. "We move," Mason ordered. Down another corridor. Yeah, down a corridor. They reached a heavy steel door. Scratches covered the inside, blood on the hinges. Mason tried the handle. Locked. "Ram it," Rhodes ordered. A battering ram hit 3 times before the lock gave out. The door swung open, and there they were. 7 children. Thin, pale, eyes wide with terror. They squinted at the light. Some backed away. Others cried softly, but one girl, a redhead in a torn t-shirt, walked forward slowly, arms raised. "You're real?" she whispered. Mason nodded. "We're real. You're safe now." Ghost moved in gently, allowing the kids to touch him, to lean on him. The girl buried her face in his fur. "I heard you," she sobbed. "Every night, I knew you were coming." They cleared the site within 2 hours. No adults found, but the setup proved this was part of a larger operation. Files were missing, computers wiped. Whoever ran it had cleared out hours before, maybe minutes. But they had the kids, and the kids were alive. That was enough for now. Back at the hospital, Mason watched as the children were reunited with their families, or placed under protective care if no relatives could be found. A nurse approached him with a walkie-talkie. "One of the girls, she keeps asking for you." He entered the room to find the red-haired girl, Lily, sitting up, eyes brighter now. She smiled when she saw him. "You have to keep going," she said. Mason sat beside her. "What do you mean?" "They said there's another place, a different state, with even more kids." Mason felt a chill roll down his spine. "Did you hear where?" She nodded slowly. "He called it the Hollow, said it was where the forgotten ones go." Mason stood, heart pounding. "You sure that's what he said?" She nodded again. "The Hollow." Ghost barked softly from the hallway. Mason turned. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. It was barely 5 a.m. when Mason hit the road. The Hollow, that's what Lily had called it. No address, no county, just a name whispered in the dark by a child who hadn't seen daylight in a week. But that was enough for Mason Turner, because Ghost believed her. And that was all Mason needed. The German Shepherd sat calmly in the back of the cruiser, eyes fixed out the window, ears twitching with every shift of the morning wind. They drove southeast, through farmlands, over back roads, past misty ridgelines and faded signs for towns that barely existed anymore. 2 hours in, Mason pulled off at a gas station in the town of Everbrook, population 122, the kind of place with a single blinking light at the only intersection, and a coffee shop that doubled as a hardware store. Mason approached the cashier, a man in his 60s with oil-stained hands and tired eyes. "You ever heard of a place around here called the Hollow?" Mason asked. The man stopped mid-swipe of a rag across the counter. He didn't answer immediately. "You asking for camping or trouble?" Mason held up his badge. The man let out a slow breath. "Take the old logging road about 5 miles south. You'll see a broken sign with no name on it. If the trees start swallowing the sky, you're close." The air changed as they approached the site. The sunlight that had bathed the hills minutes before now barely filtered through the trees. The deeper Mason drove, the narrower the trail became. Nature had almost taken it back. Then Ghost stood up in the back seat, alert, nose pressed to the glass. He began to bark. 3 sharp barks. Mason killed the engine and stepped out. The silence was heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. They were close. Ghost didn't wait. He jumped out and took off into the trees. Mason followed, weapon holstered but hand on the grip. They ran past twisted trunks and moss-covered rocks until Ghost stopped at the edge of a clearing. And there it was. A house, or what was left of one. It had been a large estate once, Victorian in design, but long since surrendered to rot and time. The roof sagged in places. The porch was missing half its boards, and the windows were dark, but not broken. Someone had kept them that way. Mason approached slowly, flashlight drawn, Ghost low beside him. They stepped onto the porch. The air smelled like mildew, old wood, and something else. Chemical, sharp, like bleach and rust. Ghost growled low. Mason reached for the doorknob. It was unlocked. Inside, the house was silent. Dust floated like ghosts through narrow beams of light. The wallpaper peeled in long strips, revealing wood and insulation beneath. Furniture stood covered in yellowed sheets, untouched for years. But the floor had footprints in the dust, small ones. Ghost led the way down a narrow hallway. At the end was a door, newer than the rest of the house, reinforced with a deadbolt in painted gray. Mason turned the knob. Locked. Ghost began to bark furiously. Mason stepped back and kicked. Once, twice. The door slammed open. Behind it, stairs, descending underground. Again. This one was different. The walls were lined with soundproof foam, the kind used in studios. Cameras, small, modern, expensive, were mounted in each corner, and the lights were on. This place was still in use. Ghost stopped suddenly and barked at the wall to the left. Mason turned and saw it, a switch panel slightly ajar. He pulled it open and gasped. Behind it, a narrow crawl space no wider than 2 feet, with insulation peeling away from the beams. And inside, a child's shoe, covered in dried blood. Mason backed away, heart pounding. He keyed his radio. Dispatch, this is Turner. I need immediate backup at my location. Potential active crime scene. Prepare for multiple victims, requesting child services on standby. The signal crackled. No response. Damn it! He tried again. Nothing. The hollow wasn't just remote, it was cut off. Deliberately. They moved deeper. At the bottom of the staircase, they entered a wide room that looked like a studio. Bright lights, a camera rack, and a row of small chairs lined against the wall. On the floor, colored tape marked "Stand Here" boxes. Mason's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just a bunker. It was a stage. And the actors were children. Ghost growled and bolted toward a door on the far end. Mason followed and froze. Inside was another room. But this one had walls covered in photos. Candid shots of children playing at recess. Bus stops. Birthday parties. All pinned in rows. Each photo had a number in the corner. Like a catalog. Mason stared in horror. They're not just abducting kids, he said quietly. They're selecting them. Tracking them like prey. Ghost whined and scratched at the floorboards. Mason looked down. A hatch. Of course. He opened it slowly. Beneath was a crawl space about 4 feet high, and the unmistakable glow of a flashlight in the distance. Not his. Someone else had been down there recently. Mason crouched and crawled forward, Ghost beside him. They moved slowly, carefully. At the end of the tunnel, they found a child's makeshift bed, a thin mattress, a teddy bear missing an eye, and a stack of drawings. One caught Mason's eye. It was the same image as before, 5 kids, a dark figure. But this time something new. Behind the dark figure stood a group of men, all wearing masks, and one wore a badge. Mason froze. His mind raced. A badge? Someone on the inside? Before he could process it, Ghost let out a sharp, warning bark. Footsteps above. Fast. Boots. Mason grabbed his radio again. Officer in active pursuit. Possible suspect on site. Request backup immediately. Still no signal. He grabbed Ghost's collar. Let's move. They crawled back through the tunnel and burst out into the main room, just in time to hear the back door slam shut. Mason ran out onto the porch and caught a glimpse of a black SUV tearing down the trail road. Too far to catch, but they'd seen him. And now they knew he was getting close. That night, Mason sat in his car outside the Cedar Falls station, eyes burning, mind racing. He had evidence now, but more importantly, he had names, photos, drawings. The infrastructure wasn't random. It was a machine hidden in plain sight, run by professionals. And somewhere in that machine was a cop. Someone with access. Someone who'd been helping cover it all up. He looked at Ghost in the rearview mirror. I need you more than ever, buddy, he whispered. Ghost thumped his tail once. Mason picked up the drawing again and looked at the corner. There, scribbled in tiny letters, was a date. Tomorrow. And a name. Warehouse 19. The rain came down hard that night, hammering the windshield like a warning. Mason sat behind the wheel of his cruiser, parked a block away from a nondescript industrial complex on the outskirts of town. It was nearly midnight, but the address was burned into his brain. Warehouse 19. There were no lights on outside, no guards, just the hum of distant street lamps and the ticking of his dashboard clock. Ghost, calm but coiled with tension, sat in the passenger seat beside him, eyes locked on the building like he could see through walls. Mason checked his radio. Static. Still no signal in this part of town. No backup, no FBI, just him, the dog, and a prayer. You ready? Mason whispered. Ghost answered with a quiet, focused growl. the kind he'd come to recognize as a yes. Mason slid a service weapon from its holster, checked the clip, and stepped into the storm. Warehouse 19 was old, the kind of building that had probably once stored hay or livestock feed, but had since been left to rot behind a fake LLC and 1,000 paper trails. Mason circled the back. No cameras, no alarms. But the door was open, just a crack. Ghost sniffed once, then slipped through like a shadow. Mason followed, his heart pounding. The inside was almost pitch black, but Mason didn't need much light to know what he'd walked into. There were cages, 5 of them, all empty. The smell of sweat, rust, and bleach filled the air. It turned Mason's stomach. But there were signs, fresh footprints in the dust, recent tire tracks by the rear exit, and one half-eaten sandwich on the table. Someone had been here. Recently, Ghost stiffened near the far wall. He let out a low bark and began scratching the concrete. Mason joined him and noticed something strange. 5 bolts in a perfect circle, surrounding a drain that didn't match the rest of the floor. He dropped to one knee and knocked. Hollow. Mason stood. "Help me out, boy." Together, they cleared the dirt and pried open the circular grate. Underneath, a tunnel, barely wide enough to crawl through. A small ladder dropped 10 feet down. "Of course," Mason muttered. "Always a tunnel." The tunnel was narrow, wet, and suffocatingly dark. Ghost led the way, nose twitching, ears high. Mason followed, flashlight beams slicing through cobwebs and thick air. After about 40 yards, the tunnel opened into a wide underground chamber. And what they saw made Mason's knees buckle. 5 children, all under 10, huddled together on a mat, drenched, cold but alive. One girl, maybe 6, was whispering a tune, the same one Lucas had hummed days earlier. She looked up as Ghost approached, and her eyes filled with tears. "I told them you'd come," she whispered. Mason blinked hard. "You're safe now. We're taking you home." They didn't move at first. Their eyes darted around the room as if waiting for someone else to appear. Then the girl spoke again. "He left before the rain. Said the next group was coming soon." Mason's blood ran cold. More children, more victims. This wasn't just the end of a hunt. It was the start of another cycle. He radioed for help again, still static. He looked at the children. "We can't wait. I'm getting you out of here myself." One by one, he guided them through the tunnel, Ghost keeping close to the rear. When they finally reached the surface, Mason pulled his phone and snapped a location pin. Then he heard it, tires screeching in the distance. An SUV, same one from the hollow. It was circling the perimeter. They'd been spotted. Mason turned to Ghost. "Keep them safe." Ghost didn't hesitate. He moved between the kids and the approaching headlights like a sentinel. Mason stepped forward, weapon raised. The SUV skidded to a stop. 2 men jumped out, faces covered in balaclavas, carrying flashlights and walkie-talkies. One spotted Mason and froze, then bolted. Mason chased, pounding through mud and gravel until he tackled the man behind a loading dock. The mask ripped off in the struggle, and Mason's breath caught. It was Officer Greg Lansing, a fellow Cedar Falls cop. The man had trained with him, ate lunch with him. "Why?" Mason growled. Lansing sneered. "You think it's just me? You think this stops here?" Mason cuffed him hard, pressing him into the dirt. "It stops tonight." The second man escaped, but they had a name, a face, a location, and 5 more kids safe in the back of a police cruiser as the rain finally stopped falling. By morning, the news broke. Underground child trafficking ring exposed in Cedar Falls. Mason stood beside the hospital window watching the sunrise. The 5 children were being reunited with family. Lily, Emily, Lucas, and the others had already begun healing. Slowly, day by day. But justice still had roads to travel. They never found the ringleader, and that haunted Mason. But every time he doubted, he looked at Ghost, sitting calmly by the door, watching every person that came through with those sharp amber eyes. The kids weren't just saved because of police work. They were saved because a dog refused to stop searching. Later that week, Mason received a call from a woman in Nebraska. Her daughter had gone missing a year ago, and 2 days earlier, a German shepherd showed up at their doorstep with a child's sock in its mouth, blood-stained. She swore it was the same dog from the news. But Ghost had been with Mason the whole time, hadn't he? He turned to the dog sleeping by his feet. "Hey," Mason said, "you ever been to Nebraska?" Ghost opened one eye and wagged his tail. As for Mason, he stayed in Cedar Falls. But the story didn't end there, because every few months, a call would come in, from a town no one paid attention to, from a parent who had lost hope. And always, there was a backpack, a paw print, and a trail only one dog could follow. Thank you for following this story. We hope it moved you, gripped you, and reminded you of the heroes that walk among us. Some with badges, some with scars, and some with 4 legs and a nose that never gives up. Now we want to hear from you. If you could ask Ghost one question, what would it be? Drop it in the comments below. We read every single one. Until next time, stay safe, stay kind, and never stop believing in second chances.